Hello, and you're all very welcome to the 2020 Leaders' Debate in the virtual Féile on Phobail. And Féile, despite the pandemic and all the pressures that's bringing with it this year, is continuing its tradition of inviting the political parties on the island to gather in a round-table debate. So I'm Áine Lawler, I'll be your chair for the next hour or so. Before I introduce the panel to you, I want to just explain that this year, obviously, normally this would be in a hall, there'd be a live audience, we'd all be closely gathered around the table. This year, because of coronavirus, the first North-South Ministerial Council meeting in years, we're here in a hotel room in Dublin. We have a couple of remote guests. I'll be introducing them to you in a minute. But what you'll see is, unfortunately, all of our guests today are male, and that's just the way it worked out. And I know it's something the organisers didn't want to happen under the circumstances with everything else that's going on. We're just lucky that we're all able to be here today. And I know that Féile is very much looking forward to next year having a fuller panel and a live audience, and that the gender balance will be much better reflected in the lineup. So let me introduce our lineup to you. We're joined by our new Minister for European Affairs, Thomas Byrne, also by Fine Gael's Fergus O'Dowd, Matt Carthy's, Sinn Féin's Matt Carthy, the SDLP's Matthew O'Toole. Steve Aiken, the Ulster Unionist Party leader, is with us remotely, as is Stephen Farry for the Alliance Party. And again, apologies for any omissions. Huge efforts were made to address all that. And we're just very glad you're all here with us. So Thomas Byrne, let's kick off with you on the day that we've had the first meeting of the North-South Ministerial Council in 3.5 years. It's been happening here in Dublin. It's happening at a time, of course, of coronavirus and Brexit looming. So those are the two big issues kind of looming before us. In terms of COVID-19, I noticed Micheál Martin was talking today very constructively about the engagements that happened. Your party's made great play out of new relationships. So in terms of COVID, what do you want to see North and South doing together that they're not doing now?
Well, I think he's right to be constructive about it, because I think the relationship has, by and large, been extremely constructive over the last few months in relation to COVID. And that continues now with the government, the new government in place, but also particularly now, I think, with the North-South Ministerial Council meeting, people meeting together to discuss a range of issues, including health. And we have seen a memorandum of understanding signed by the previous government with the Assembly. That continues, obviously, now. Stephen Donnelly, our new health minister, has developed good relations with his counterpart in the North. We have seen, for example, the contact tracing app is a really good example, the only one in the world, I think, that can be operated across borders. And that's really, really important, particularly where we have free travel. Still, there's no travel restrictions north and south. And indeed, the travel restrictions outside the island are actually similar. The advice north and south is not to travel. The difference is that there's a longer list of countries where you don't have to quarantine coming home from in the north than there is in the south. And I think that is a difference of approach. But fundamentally, actually, the advice isn't very different at all, that people shouldn't travel.
I mean, of course, we're in a difficult situation in terms, because you've got, the EU aspect and you've got the common travel area. Talk to me about the role of the British-Irish Council that's being identified here.
Well, I mean, look, I mean, the starting point is the island. I mean, we are an island here. We want to make sure that we maintain COVID. The easiest way to do it is on an all-island basis in the first instance. Clearly, there are even bigger difficulties in Britain. I think we have to be very, very conscious of that, and it is difficult to maintain a similarity of approach when obviously the case numbers are vastly different. The approach at different points has been different. I think the Northern Ireland approach to travel is born of the, you might say, the UK-wide approach. That's the way that is, and that's not to disrespect it, but it's slightly different from where we are. But I think that we can do more on better cooperation. The contact tracing app being a fantastic example. But fundamentally, we want people to stay on the island as best people can, unless it's an absolutely necessary journey.
Let's bring in one of our remote panellists. And Steve Aiken today, I was struck by Arlene Foster talking about the executive being formed in January and then heading straight into a pandemic. Did COVID-19...
As the party that holds the health ministry in Northern Ireland, and Robin Swan, who's been doing an absolutely fantastic job as the health minister, with the support of the health department that has managed to completely transform itself along with the health professionals in Northern Ireland in a very short space of time to deal with this. Indeed, when Robin took over as the health minister, and as I walked out of the door from the meeting where I told him he was about to become the health minister, and we looked at his first day brief, and he said, you know, the funny thing at the bottom of this is it says, in the event of a pandemic, I'm in charge. And it's actually been very good to see that Robin has been able to establish such a strong relationship across these islands. And you'll hear me today talk a lot about islands, in particular the relationship with the rest of our nation, the United Kingdom, but also with the Irish Republic as well. And to be able to bring in very sensible sort of approaches. And indeed, look, we've gone through a bit of a bumpy ride as well, because if you don't have to go very far back when Michelle O'Neill and Conor Murphy were busy trying to say to Robin that he wasn't doing anything about getting enough PPE, only to discover that the much vaunted PPE order by Sinn Féin didn't actually exist. And from that, we seem to have been getting onto a better track in Northern Ireland and dealing with COVID across the whole islands piece. But unfortunately, the events of Bobby Story's funeral on the 30th of June, and where the Deputy First Minister and the many ministers and many MLAs from Sinn Féin completely disregarded the rules and guidelines, has in a large degree undermined a lot of the health message we're trying to get across. So when your question about how do we improve North-South cooperation, the first thing is we need to agree that we do stick to the rules and the guidelines that are within our jurisdictions. And then we need to work very closely together to make sure that things like travellers coming in from the sort of the southern United States and travellers coming in via sort of Doha into Dublin Airport, those travellers are potentially at significant risk. We're able to transfer that data so we know where they're travelling on this island and indeed beyond this island. And I think that's one of the most important things we need to do. But I understand today sort of the relationship. Robin was down to the North-South Ministerial, and we look forward to a continuation of good working relationships, North and South and East and West.
Okay, I'm sorry to be cutting across you remotely. Obviously, there's a delay on the line. But my question to you is that, you know, despite all the issues that you mentioned, we did see Arlene Foster and Michelle O'Neill sharing a podium today. Did COVID-19 make power sharing, did it help or hinder it, do you think?
Well, look, I think that one of the good things is, and you know better than most what coalition governments are like, and bearing in mind Northern Ireland, we have to have a mandatory coalition. 3/4 of the Northern Ireland executive are actually working quite well together. 3/4 of it are pulling in the right direction. 3/4 of it are actually delivering. Now, the other quarter, which has to be Sinn Féin, they need to get their act together and join in with the rest of them. And I imagine today Arlene Foster had a really difficult choice to make when she was down and bearing in mind she is in the other unionist party, and I would never speak for the DUP, and I never expect them to speak for me. But I would imagine she had a very difficult choice to make today, to be seen even standing close on the platform with Michelle O'Neill, particularly because the anger in our community about what happened on the 30th of June across the community, particularly over the issues of the funeral and what was being done and the rules and guidelines being breached, that hasn't gone away. And that is something we need to work on, because we must get the last quarter of the Northern Ireland Executive to be pulling with the rest of the Northern Ireland Executive to deal with what I think, unfortunately, is a massive second wave which is on its way. And we're beginning to see the starting of that now. OK. Matt Carthy, again, given all the events that Steve Aiken has been referring to there, in your assessment, has COVID-19 helped or hindered power sharing? And how do you respond to what Steve Aiken has said there about Sinn Féin being the quarter of the executive that's not pulling its weight yet?
Well, first of all, I think Steve has illustrated just the mentality of some of those people who don't want to be in power sharing with Republicans. They don't consider us to be equals in terms of being equal citizens in the North. And it's that mentality that in many ways made the process of peace building so difficult, and will mean that consistently there will always be difficulties with regard to power sharing. But power sharing, it has to be. That's what the Good Friday Agreement set in place. That's what was agreed by electorates north and south. And whether Steve likes it or not, Sinn Féin are a party with a very strong mandate north and south, and we're going to be part of that power sharing
and has the COVID problem.
Structure. So let me just say this in relation to this idea that Sinn Féin are somehow being pulled along. It was because of Michelle O'Neill and because of her actions that we managed to move away from the very dangerous position of the health minister and of the UUP, which was tacitly supported by other parties, unfortunately, which was actually not to close schools, not to do some of the basic instruments that were happening all over Europe, never mind the island of Ireland, everywhere essentially, apart from Britain, because they were intent on adhering to what was and is now clearly a failed strategy being implemented by Westminster. So we've moved beyond that, and that's absolutely a good thing. And the fact that we have the institutions in the north has meant that we have been able to withstand some of the worst successes of British policy in regard to the COVID-19 response. But there will always be challenges and difficulties. You're dealing with a forced coalition of parties that come at these issues from different perspectives. So there will always be challenges. But I think in the round, it is, and let me put it this way, it is much, much better that the executive was put in place in January in order to deal with the necessary response to COVID-19.
Stephen Farry, your assessment of the way that the parties have been cooperating or not through this COVID crisis, and where the cooperation or otherwise needs to go in future?
Well, Anya, to start on a positive, I think we have to acknowledge that because we have had power sharing restored just in time, I think the response in Northern Ireland has been more effective than it would otherwise have been the case under direct rule, because we have had the ability to tailor our response to fit our own local circumstances. There's a very delicate balance to find between that degree of localism, and equally we look across the North Channel and see Scotland, where they've been very effective as well in terms of their response, as has the south of Ireland, compared to the greatest population centre in terms of England. But I think where we can be critical is around the level of coordination between all of the jurisdictions across these islands. While there has been some good communication, it hasn't been good enough. I was on a call with the Prime Minister of the UK this morning and stressing the need for a much more formal, almost mini summit between all of the jurisdictions, because particularly as we emerge from the more strict lockdown and we face up to the reality that this is going to be persisting for quite some time, there is a better need to coordinate the impact of different decisions being taken in different jurisdictions. Even across the island, there's different approaches towards travel and returns from outside different countries on the green list. There are other issues in terms of what people can and cannot do, which creates certain anomalies, particularly around the border areas. So we need to find a better means of addressing those, because to avoid confusion or passing on problems to our neighbours. So I think much more work can be done in that particular regard over the coming weeks. But I think it's important to stress that this is still going to be an ongoing problem, and people are realising that this isn't going away. We're now settling into a stable level of cases, or if anything, it's nudging itself up, and that should be a cause of alarm.
Certainly. And Matthew O'Toole, we've heard health experts like Dr. Gabriel Scally say again and again and again, I think Michelle O'Neill was talking about it today in her remarks after the council meeting, that, physically we could be like New Zealand, but of course politically it's a much more difficult thing to align the jurisdictions. So in terms of dealing with this crisis. So this idea of the British-Irish Council, is that the way to go, do you think, in getting the kind of measures and extra cooperation that Stephen Farry was talking about?
Well, it might be one way, and I think if it can come up with with constructive but practical answers, that would be a good thing. Part of the challenge, of course, is that one of the main parties to that is Boris Johnson, and constructive and practical are not words that immediately would be associated with Boris Johnson. I think to go back to the point about us being an island unit, there are there's the practical challenge of managing an epidemic on an island which has a shared demography, in that we only have a few big urban centres, to be honest. Unlike Britain, for example, we have a relatively spread out, largely rural population once you leave sort of Belfast, Dublin, and Cork, to be honest. There are inbuilt advantages to that, and that shouldn't become a kind of constitutional stress for people to think about us managing an epidemic in that way. And actually,
where there's a will, there's a way.
Yes, I will also say that it's important when you have these when we have these debates to recognise that in terms of how the common travel area works, and in terms of how people move around the islands, it's important to be respectful of the sensitivities, and there will be sensitivities for people's identities. I think talking through the practicalities and actually putting public health at the forefront, and not making everything a kind of an essentialised constitutional question when it comes to public health, is an important way of dealing with things. But yes, ultimately, let's be honest, we have an advantage in being on an island, and we've already seen, I think, some of the advantages of being on an island. In relation to the north, actually, it's probably true that people in Northern Ireland took their cue a little bit from what was happening in Dublin. I would add, in parenthesis, that there probably could have been better communications from the government in Dublin whenever things were first locked down. I would say that, but at the same time, people in the north lots of people in the north effectively took their cue from what was happening. In the case of Derry, if they're locking down a few miles away, people take their cue from that, and I think we did. So I think that actually helped slow the spread of COVID. So yes, we are on an island. We have particular demographic characteristics that will enable us to better manage this epidemic. We should take advantage of those advantages.
And Fergus O'Dowd, in terms of the future cooperation, we've a couple of critical months ahead if we're not to have the second wave that Steve Aiken is so fearful of, that so many people are fearful of. So the practical steps that need to be taken in the south, in the north, amongst the islands to get things moving. Where do you see it going?
Well, I think we're seeing signs of it today. I mean, the fact that they're in Dublin, that they got a briefing, as I understand it, from our public health experts here. And it really is all about public health. You're absolutely right. It's whatever the advice is, we have to follow it. And obviously the advice changes as knowledge increases. And there's no barrier to the fact that you must keep your distance, you must wear your mask, you must wash your hands. There is a problem for families. We have grandchildren in the UK. We can't see them, and they want to come over here. They can, but we're saying don't come, and that's replicated in thousands of homes. So there's huge issues, and I think the more we can work together, and if the public health advice is the same, and it isn't the same at the moment, we can't do what we want to do, but that is the priority: save lives. So I think that the political system obviously is driven by knowledge and by facts, and everything else is not really relevant. And I think if we do what we're told to do, we will defeat this epidemic, and if we don't, we won't. Right. And that's what's happening in other countries right now. It's beginning to multiply again.
But uniquely, of course, the challenge on these two islands in the next winter is not just going to be dealing with the pandemic. It's also going to be dealing with the issue of Brexit. Thomas Byrne, again, Arlene Foster talking today about wanting to see a comprehensive agreement. The time frame left, it means there's only a short while if a deal is going to be done this autumn. And the reality, according to most observers, is it's going to be a Brexit deal light, if it's a deal at all, isn't it?
Well, certainly we're very concerned about it, and the government has taken steps now to intensify preparations for a very light Brexit deal or indeed a no deal. So you'll be hearing a lot more from the government here from September on preparation for Brexit. We need to prepare for it anyway. It's going to happen. But particularly in terms of the risks that are there in terms of a no deal or a limited deal on goods, for example. And the negotiations between the EU and Britain are at a delicate stage at the moment, and they're ongoing, but they are ongoing. Rate
the chances of a deal.
It's going to be difficult. I mean, some of the mood music has improved a bit, I think, over the last few weeks, but the government has taken a decision to prepare on the basis of no deal or limited deal. So that tells you that we're very concerned about it, and we're acting as if it could be bad. it could be a bad outcome. But certainly we want a deal. I certainly hope that the British will want a good deal. And I know that the EU negotiating team is working very hard on that. We have obviously the protocol on Northern Ireland, and I suppose the key issue there is to make sure that the implementation of that is carried out in accordance with what's required there. And that's been, that again, there is a lot of work ongoing in the background on that.
But you're basically crossing your fingers and
hoping,
we're not.
Aren't you? We're preparing. We're preparing for the.
But you can't deliver a deal from the other side.
No, I can't deliver a deal for we have the protocol in Northern Ireland, so that's a question of Britain implementing that. There's negotiations ongoing between the EU and the UK. They're still going, but we as a government here are preparing, not crossing our fingers at all. We're actively preparing for the possibility that things won't work out as we might want them to work out.
And then crossing your fingers in terms of whether there's going to be a deal, and that would be, do you know what I mean?
I accept that, but that's I suppose that's the state of play of negotiations at the moment. So we certainly hope, and I would say expect, but a lot will depend on how those negotiations go as they restart maybe towards the end of August and back into the autumn then.
And Steve Aiken, of course, here we tend to focus on the impact, whether it's in Northern Ireland, whether it's going to be here in the south. But I've been looking particularly at Scotland recently, and I'm wondering about the impact of the increased support for Scottish independence as a result of Brexit. I'm wondering about the impact of all of that in Northern Ireland, particularly in terms of the unionist community in Northern Ireland. Would you talk a little about that?
Look, one of the reasons I supported Remain and was very clearly wanted to see Northern Ireland and the United Kingdom remaining with the EU was the fact that we didn't want to see any diminution or any borders coming down the Irish Sea. And now that we've seen, and in fact, Boris Johnson is putting a border down the Irish Sea, which is going to have considerable implications, not just for Northern Ireland, but also for the Irish Republic, particularly when we talk about how we manage things like goods at risk and VAT returns, and also how we manage if there's any sort of penalties and goods at risk coming into Northern Ireland, there's any reciprocation on the land bridge from Holyhead to the Channel ports for Irish goods trying to get into the EU. You can see that there is a lot of uncertainty. And, we have been calling time and time again, and indeed with the Prime Ministers, with the Taoiseach, with the First Minister in Scotland and the First Minister of Wales, in the last week alone, I've been saying to them, look, we need to get to an agreed solution so that we are maybe to maintain these flows of goods coming into Northern Ireland, but also sort of north, south and east, west, because it's not going to help anybody. And actually the economic impact, north and south will be massive unless we can get this sorted out. But as to your question about Nicola Sturgeon and how this is playing out, and one of the things we've got to be very aware of from a unionist perspective is not just sort of Brexit and COVID, but how all these things play together. And my biggest problem is, of course, is that the biggest recruiting sergeant for the SNP at the moment seems to be Boris Johnson. And indeed, one of the probably biggest recruiting sergeants for all forms of English nationalism at the moment seems to be Boris Johnson. We need some statesman-like behaviour from the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom to realise it is a United Kingdom and we need to be working more closely together for everybody. But one of the things I want to see, and this is what I've said, to the Taoiseach na Tánaiste last week, is the one thing I want to see, and over the last 3 years has unfortunately been dissipated away quite a lot, is we need to restore a bit of faith and confidence in north, south and east, west relations. And by doing that, and also dealing with the problems with Brexit, and also working on a all islands approach to some of the COVID issues, that might answer a lot of the questions on the Union, and particularly in the United Kingdom. Look, I don't think a breakup of the United Kingdom is likely. Like, I lived in Scotland for a considerable period of time. My two eldest daughters live in Scotland. I am very aware of the mood music in Scotland, on the streets in Scotland. And yes, people are very supportive of Nicola Sturgeon and a lot of things she's been doing. But equally, there's a big groundswell of opinion against the idea of having another Scottish referendum. And indeed, it's nearly as big as the groundswell that I'm feeling in Northern Ireland about any idea about a border poll.
We'll come back to that question in a minute, but before I come back to the panel here, Stephen Parry, on that question of Scotland, the rising support for independence and the fact that Brexit could, some say, accelerate the breakup of the union.
Mm-hmm. I think that is a genuine risk. The main tension in the House of Commons at present is between the Conservative Party and the SNP, and both are feeding off each other. Obviously, there's going to be elections in Scotland in 2021 for the Scottish Parliament, so the odds would be that the SNP will come back with a majority of seats, and they will run on a manifesto seeking a further referendum. At present, both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party are determined to say no to that. So that's going to create a major source of tension, and we could see some sort of play out, something similar to the dynamics between Spain and Catalonia over the next number of years, and that's going to be, I think, be a major feature of this current Parliament. Whatever happens on Brexit at the end of this year occurs. And that is going to be certainly part of the wider fluidity that we're seeing on constitutional questions. And without doubt, what happens in Scotland will have knock-on implications for Northern Ireland and the rest of the island of Ireland.
And just picking up on that, Matt Carthy, I remember doing an interview with your colleague in Belfast, Mórcia Nómhuillior, shortly after the Brexit vote. It was one of those early morning political results programmes. And he said, Brexit, if you're a Republican, is the gift that keeps on giving. Is that the way your party still sees it?
No, I wasn't aware that Martin said that.
It was Brexit, early morning and he'd been up late at night.
Brexit is bad for Ireland. It's bad for everybody. I'm an Irish Republican, so clearly I naturally want to see anything that accelerates Irish unity, and I do think that Brexit has been an accelerant to the debate, at least. But I'm also a father, I'm also a representative of a community that will suffer greatly, and my children will probably have to emigrate if we have a bad Brexit deal, because the local economy in my region in particular will be just devastated by a situation where trade links, for example, were to revert to WTO. But having said that, what Brexit did was expose the undemocratic nature of partition crystally. So you have to, just to go back to the rationale behind partition. The Irish people had clearly declared for independence. The British establishment refused to accept that, and they essentially, in an arbitrary carve-up, decided to draw a line on the map that had no basis in reality. The 6 counties weren't an entity of any geographical basis. It was specifically in order to ensure that there would be an inbuilt pro-British majority. That clearly led to conflict and all of and we can have a big debate about that, but let's not. We came out of conflict by a historic compromise. And the historic compromise was people like me, Irish Republicans, agreed that there would be no change to the constitutional status of those 6 counties until a majority of the people there agreed to it. What Brexit was a clear breach of that, because the majority of people in the 6 counties voted to remain part of the European Union, and the British government and some of their cohorts and vocalists in Belfast and elsewhere said, tough luck, you're leaving the European Union regardless of the consequences, regardless of the cost, and regardless of the democratic imperative. So what Brexit did for a whole new generation was reawaken the debate. Now, lots of people, both in Dublin and in Belfast and everywhere else, have been doing everything in their power since that referendum to try and push that debate back into a bottle, but it's not going to be pushed back in, because Brexit in itself won't lead to a united Ireland. Brexit has accelerated a debate that was naturally going to happen, and in my view has created a whole new political framework. And I think it's exciting in many respects.
I should say, by the way, that unfortunately Minister Thomas Byrne, he had to go because of another meeting. Again, it's just part of this mad world we're living in at the moment. So before I bring in the other panellists, Matt Carthy, that brings me to a question which actually came up in last year's debate at Féile on Phobail. And it was when Gregory Campbell was talking about his identity and there was an exchange going on. But Leo Varadkar interrupted with, but what would a new Ireland look like? How would it reflect the unionist identity? So a border poll would only solve one question, wouldn't tell you what the Ireland was going to be like that would come into effect as a result of such a poll if it were to happen. How would you envisage respecting a British identity in any new Ireland after a border poll?
What I will say is that the British identity has to be protected. We are an island nation that has different cultures, different traditions, different identities, and it has to be protected. But it's not for me to tell Steve, how can I protect your British identity? That's not for me. It's in many respects, for Stephen to tell us what needs to be done. Yes, I accept that he's going to do everything in his power politically to try and ensure that the United Ireland never happens. Yes, but he might not have a choice in regarding whether it's happening, but he does have a choice in terms of what it means. So that's why we've been saying, long before Brexit, but particularly since Brexit, let's have those conversations now. Let's not do what the Brexiteers did, which was basically campaign for a political motive and then the day after the referendum have no idea what's going to happen. Let's ensure that when people go to vote on the question of Irish unity, they know what it means. And that can't happen unless everybody has a conversation. And unfortunately, almost everybody else is saying we're refusing to have that conversation.
I really want to bring in Matthew and Fergus, but I want to go back to Steve Aiken on that question just put by Matt Carthy, that you may not have a choice about the fact that there would be a border poll, but you would have a choice about the kind of Ireland that would result. What's your reaction to that?
Well, first thing is, I don't think there is going to be a border poll. I don't think we're going to get into the situation where the circumstances for having a border poll are going to come about. I don't see it happening this year, in 5 years, 10 years, or maybe even longer. And I think one of the things we first of all need to do, and this is why I'm in politics, is we need to get Northern Ireland working. And the first thing we need to do is for people to buy in and make sure that for everybody in Northern Ireland, we do what's best for everybody in Northern Ireland. The whole idea of a border poll is just a distraction. It is an absolute distraction from the real issues that we need to sort out. We've got massive issues with health, massive issues with education. We've got massive issues to deal with climate change. We've got a prosperity agenda where we need to transform Northern Ireland around. Quite frankly, who in the Irish Republic would want Northern Ireland? Who would want us until we can sort ourselves out? Equally, for the people of Northern Ireland, we want to show for everybody in the United Kingdom that we can be a valued part of the United Kingdom, which I believe we are, and we can really improve on itself. Look, as a unionist, and as somebody who lived in Dublin for 5 years and was the chief executive of the British Irish Chamber of Commerce and was the chief executive of a major university, I want to see the Irish Republic do very well. We need the Irish Republic to do very well. But I also want to see Northern Ireland do very well within the United Kingdom. And any talk about a border poll is just an absolute distraction from what we really need to do for the health, the prosperity, the education, and how we deal with the biggest challenge we all have, not just in this island, but across the world, is climate change.
Matthew O'Toole, I've kept you out of this for too long. What's your view on that exchange?
Well, my view is that it's correct that Brexit has fundamentally changed the context in which, in the constitutional context of these islands, it has completely and fundamentally changed that. And the reason is that the Good Friday Agreement settlement was fundamentally about reforming and changing the UK state. It was about slightly smudging sovereignty in relation to Northern Ireland, where Northern Ireland would remain in the UK, but it would have a unique relationship with the rest of Ireland and unique citizenship rights. That was underpinned by common membership of the European Union. Brexit has changed that. Whatever your constitutional perspective, whether you are a unionist, nationalist, or indeed you don't subscribe to either of those persuasions, it is the terms. The UK state is changing fundamentally. It is therefore legitimate for people in Northern Ireland, indeed in Scotland, and anywhere else, to ask questions about the long-term constitutional setup. I am someone who does believe that moving towards a new Ireland, a new constitutional settlement on this island is something that can be full of hope and positivity for everyone on this island. But in a strange way, I also agree with Steve that we can first make Northern Ireland work, and that doesn't have to get in the way of constitutional change. I don't think making Northern Ireland, its institutions, its economy work, block a new Ireland. In a sense, I think it should help make the argument for constitutional change. But look, the UK state's changing. Really fundamentally, it's changing. it has decided that vote happened in 2016. The way it was implemented has been in the most damaging way possible, not just to people in Northern Ireland, not just to people in Ireland generally, but to people in Britain, to many of the people who voted for it. I think it's completely reasonable that we start to have conversations about how our constitution might change. Now, to go back to the question about Britishness in a united or new Ireland, that's something that isn't just, it's not just a necessity. I think for someone like me, it's something that's completely critical. I do want to remove the presence of an international sovereign border, as it were, in this island. I do think that's the right way to go, but that doesn't mean that that's an act of hostility against either Britishness in Ireland or indeed the island of Britain. What the Good Friday Agreement did is it, in a sense, bound together our islands and in an acknowledgement that we are profoundly connected, whatever your constitutional perspective or identity on the island of Ireland. It said that we're going to have to, our relations are close and we are going to have to accommodate and respect them moving forward. So, in a new Ireland, and I very much hope there is a new Ireland, and I'm not, actually, Matt, I'm not afraid of the conversation. I'm having the conversation, and I'm going to be having the conversation going forward. But in that conversation, I want to make absolutely clear that the Britishness of people like Steve is something, it's not just something I want to accommodate or tolerate, it's something I want to celebrate. Britishness on this island is something that is... And
is it just up to him to tell you what that is?
Well, it's up to Steve and everyone else. I think Steve is, Steve is not someone who I think is intolerant of Irishness in the context of Northern Ireland, and I would hope he and other people like him would understand that in the context of a new, some form of new constitutional relationship, I and people like me wouldn't in any way be not just not intolerant, but not like welcoming of Britishness in this. So I think, that will involve some difficult conversations on both sides of the border about Britishness, what Britishness, our history and what Britishness means on this island, and that we can then that Britishness and Irishness can sit not just alongside one another in a kind of binary way, but people can feel both of them. Like, I'm an Irishman, but I have neighbours in Belfast, I have constituents who feel Britishness and Irishness together, and they don't see any contradiction in that. I want our new constitutional settlement to find a way of exemplifying and celebrating that. And there are also, one final point, there's a huge amount of Irishness in the island of Britain that of different traditions, and we should be celebrating that. And whatever new constitutional settlement we move to, I think we can celebrate. Celebrating that plurality is going to have to be a key part of it.
And while, despite different people's different political positions, what I am hearing everybody saying is there needs to be a lot of dialogue about how things are managed going forward. So Fergus O'Dowd, given that we've got this all-island unit in the Taoiseach's department that's going to be looking at the relationships north and south and east and west, what structures should this new government in the south, for instance, be looking in dialogue with its partners to be putting in place?
Yeah, but obviously already under the Good Friday Agreement you have areas where there is joint cooperation, and you also have areas where policy is agreed and the administrations separately carry out those activities. So I think we need to identify new areas, north and south, through the North-South Ministerial Council, where we can undertake joint new initiatives, north and south, and agree them. And I think what Steve Aiken said there initially was about working together. That must happen, absolutely. While a lot of progress has been made, I think Matt, in a way, and I know he iterates, the traditional view, I think the fact is that what's happening in the north is that there is demographic change on its way. And in 10, 15 years' time, there's going to be a different demographic there. And that's why I personally don't have an issue with looking at, what plans can we work together and show that we can do the business north and south. But I don't have a problem with a border poll either. I think that's a legitimate aspiration that people should be able to participate in. And I think one of the things which should be happening is that, the question of the Irish diaspora electing our president. And I think there is a referendum.
So we need to make an expanded Irishness open to more people. Is that what you're saying?
But the whole thing about such a referendum is that people in the north who wish to would participate in the election, and you'd have us canvassing. You'd have people in the north being canvassed by people in the south, and maybe people like Steve or others coming down here to give their point of view and get an idea of a new Ireland and a new dynamic. And I think that's the future.
Sorry, Fergus, to be cutting across you. In that regard, I know, like we've all heard Ian Marshall talk about his disappointment that there wasn't an appointment made to the Shams from Northern Ireland in the Taoiseach's nominees. That was a missed opportunity, wasn't it?
It was, of course, but there's also another opportunity, and I've just been appointed chairman of the implementation of the Good Friday Agreement in the Oireachtas, where people like Steve and members of other political parties in the North can come into our Oireachtas, come into my committee, or we'll go to them, or find a vehicle or a place where we can meet with Steve and parliamentarians from the North in Stormont or wherever to talk about these issues. But there is a huge opportunity there, and I certainly intend that we will grasp that. And I know Steve of old, we've met, and we know what both of us think, and obviously reaching out to unionists and to all parties. That's the future, and leave everything behind in a new Ireland. And I think if we have the ambition, we have ambition for our people. We want them to be well. We want this COVID thing to be dealt with. We want people at work. It'll only work in a new Ireland, and that's the future for all of us.
Steve Aiken, how do you respond to that?
Well, sort of Fergus and I over many a libation over many evenings have discussed a lot of these issues, and it comes back to the whole process again of we want to make sure that Northern Ireland works, we want to make sure the Republic of Ireland works, but we want to make sure that these whole islands work together and work effectively. Look, and going back to Matt McCarthy's point and some other points as well, there has to be a recognition somewhere in this dialogue, in fact, that the answer to recognising the British identity, and I'm Irish and I'm British, and I have no contradiction in those views, but the answer is probably what we already have. It is Northern Ireland being part of the United Kingdom. It is in the Good Friday Belfast Agreement as it's laid down. It is in the implications of what the Belfast Agreement has said, and the fact it's built around the principles of consent. But the main thing is that everybody is working together for the best benefit of the people across these islands. And as I said to the Taoiseach not so long ago, and he asked me would I be involved in the shared island group, and I said no. And actually, I don't think you're going to get any unionists going to be involved in it. But tell you what, why don't you put an S on the end of the island and call it the Shared Islands Unit? We can all meet in the Isle of Man and look at how we can really sort out north, south, and east, west relationships. So there's a challenge to you, Fergus, and I will be delighted to come down and see you.
Can I make a point? Because what Steve says is all very well and good, but it's exactly the argument that we've heard against any progressive and substantial change that we've ever witnessed, particularly in Ireland and particularly in recent years. First thing that needs to be made absolutely clear in debates like this is that the pursuit of Irish unity is absolutely legitimate, and it is absolutely in line with the Good Friday Agreement and with the constitutional aspirations that are laid down by this state. So those people who want to pursue it aren't being decisive or divisive. They're not being they're not being disruptive. They are pursuing an absolutely legitimate aim on the basis, and the reason I want to see United Ireland, it's not just to complete a few ballots. It's actually to deliver a better Ireland for everyone who lives there. I believe absolutely, yes, we need to be working for a better health service in this state and a better health service in the north. But I happen to believe that we'd have a better health service if it was an all-Ireland health service, because it would make more sense. I believe we'd have a better transport system if it was done on an all-Ireland basis. I believe we'd have a better education system if we had co-joined and all-Ireland approach to it. I believe that across the board. So in line with that, I believe fundamentally, therefore, that I have an obligation to actually pursue Irish unity. And what I think those of us and people like Fergus and people like Thomas who come from parties who say that they also want to see a united Ireland, I think our first obligation is to start talking about what and how we bring that about and how we can make sure that it's actually a success for everybody who shares this island. That's absolutely legitimate, and that's absolutely, in my view, in the best interest of the Irish people, north and south.
I would say a couple of things. First of all, Matt's right that the Good Friday Agreement is very clear that the pursuing a constitutional aspiration of Irish unification is in there. I mean, it's in that document, and it's not an illegitimate thing to do. Steve is, in a sense, also right that he and unionism, unionists, whether in the Ulster Unionists or any other party, are entitled to make an argument for the continuation of the UK. That's also in the Good Friday Agreement. The Good Friday Agreement is not a post-dated check for unity, and it's not a warning that you can't talk about unity. It's neither of those things. It's I think it's a sort of an instruction manual for how you do these things and how you manage relationships on this island. And yes, Steve, on these islands, I don't think moving to a new constitution for this island necessarily means. It clearly would mean a different kind of relationship, certainly for Northern Ireland with Britain, but that doesn't mean it's a hostile or foreign or antagonistic relationship. In fact, I think it should be something much, much closer than that. But I would also just say gently that why this is really important, those of us who have specific constitutional preferences, and obviously I approach this in a different way to Matt's party, but also in a different way, frankly, to some of the other parties on the island. What's really critical is that we recognise that a lot of the people who are going to make their minds up on this, and that this goes for people, if you like, from liberal-minded, small U unionists, if you like, in Northern Ireland, but also people in the Republic who don't give this a lot of thought, and Matt, some of them might even have voted for Sinn Féin in the last election. These are people we do need to think about how we place the context of a new Ireland in a way that's relevant for them. How we explain to them how that. You talked about the health service. That's true, but also dealing with climate change, dealing with the demographic challenge, not the Northern Ireland demographic challenge, but how population change and going forward. How do we deal with those 21st century challenges in the context of a changed constitution here?
But just to stress what you said, the Alliance Party, we're neither a unionist nor nationalist party, but these are debates that we can nonetheless approach with a degree of confidence and belief in terms of our values. So we are certainly very conscious that this is a very fluid debate. It's not just a debate in terms of the island of Ireland, it's also a debate in terms of the Union of the UK and also the islands as a whole. We're happy to take part in any debates as long as they're rational, they're constructive, on an entirely without prejudice basis to where this goes. In some respects, it is that liberal centre ground in Northern Ireland that will be pivotal in terms of any outcome. And I would say to Matt in particular that as much as I recognise his right to pursue a United Ireland as a legitimate aim, and the rules are set out under the Good Friday Agreement, that level of support doesn't exist at present to make that a reality. He can certainly campaign for it, but there's a lot of work to persuade people if indeed that is the course of action that people take. But there is a lot of work that we have to do in terms of stress testing things around the economy, the financial issues, even the granular detail as to how a border poll would actually operate in practice. The Good Friday Agreement just addresses the issues at a very high level. I think University College London are doing a lot more work around that particular issue. I think the one point I would stress as well is that while there is that fluidity in terms of people's view on this, perhaps we shouldn't think about the future choices purely in a binary sense. It's either a fully unitary United Kingdom versus a unitary Irish state. There may well be a host of different scenarios in between that could find a greater degree of consensus. I think it's important that we have an open mind to all of those, because whatever way this falls, there are going to be dangers and perceptions of winners and losers, and that needs to be addressed with a large degree of sensitivity as we look to the future. But for sure, these debates have been opened up largely by Brexit, and it would be naive to pretend that they don't exist. And certainly, I'm happy to take part in the Good Friday Agreement Committee and their activists. So I'll hopefully see Fergus in the near future in that regard.
Actually, I was smiling when you were talking about binary choices there, because it's one of the things I find when I'm arguing with my grown-up kids now is you're so binary, Mum, because I just can't. And it's me not getting my head around modern politics. I just want to stay with this question of relationships, which we're all talking about at the moment. It's the buzzword, and you've obviously got a busy diary, Fergus O'Dowd, coming up. But Matt Carthy, if we're going to be having all this dialogue and progress is going to be made and we're going to deal with all the problems that are coming down the tracks, north, south, east, west, and all the rest, what about the relationships between Sinn Féin and the political parties in the south, which are very contested at the moment, when, on the other hand, the parties are supposed to be cooperating, in terms of north, south, and this bigger picture?
I think what sometimes gets missed is we actually work with parties, north, south, east and west, on a raft of different issues. And a lot of ministers, they will never say it in your Week in Politics studio, but they would contest privately that we are very constructive in terms of development of policy and in terms of pursuing policy goals. I think Brexit was probably a very clear example of that at a European level. There's a fundamental problem.
TDs in your own party have said to me off the record, who will go in with us? Who will talk to us? I mean, a lot of people in your party are really frustrated, stymied and upset at what they see is their exclusion from the table.
Well, I think most of our TDs are, fairly politically astute. They understand that. I'll give you this. A lot of the people who voted for us are very angry and upset with the exclusion of us from government negotiations and all of that. But I'm very clear. Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael will exclude Sinn Féin for as long as they possibly can. And the reason they will is because we're a party that want radical change in our country, and they're parties that are committed, by and large, to the maintenance of the status quo. So for as long as that's the case, yes, they will. But a point will come when our political strength, just as it was in the North, comes to such a point that people can't ignore us or exclude us any longer. And in many respects, I think if anybody looks at the political discourse, even in Dublin, Sinn Féin are setting it out. The reason the excesses of ministerial pay, for example, became political issues is because Sinn Féin are the largest opposition party. The reason we're having big conversations in terms of what kind of health service we now have, we're having a conversation around the national question. We're having all of these big political conversations. So yes, as the established parties try and diminish those or try and sideline those questions, and to some instances they can be successful, but the way we overcome all of that is political strength. And when we get to a point, and this has been proven in councils and in other structures all over the place, when we get to a point of political structures, well, then the other parties will engage with us and they will find a constructive, pragmatic party that is committed to radical change, but is also committed to getting things done on behalf of the people who we represent.
Is it Fine Gael versus Sinn Féin? Is that what Southern politics is shaping up to? And how does that impact in terms of, all this kind of inter-island, area cooperation?
Well, anybody who's a member of the Oireachtas, their votes are equal in terms of the membership of the Oireachtas. So we have to talk. I talk to all people all the time.
Fergus is actually a very nice fella.
Well, that's what you think, Pat. Where did I see you outside?
Fergus, I think you're the most popular panellist we've got today. Do you know that?
Can I be honest with you? I think where I disagree with Sinn Féin is the way they try and paint, the way it talks about the status quo, Matt. The status quo last February, even though we lost the election, was we had full employment. We had millions of euros coming in terms of jobs. We had tackled...
I wouldn't recommend you try and fight the election again, because there's lots of people in your own constituency are very eager for another election.
I'm not interested in that right now. This is an intellectual debate, I hope, where we're addressing other issues. I'm addressing the factual situation. Is this that I think that we did a damn good job in government. The people didn't elect us, I accept that. But they're beginning to see what we did do, that saving money and putting it aside for the rainy day. It's here today. With you guys, it'll be gone today. That's the difference. But when you move away from that point, the question really is there a future that Sinn Féin and Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil can share?
It's about the relationship.
Of course there is. Of course there is. But the history is, I was around, obviously, when all the troubles were there. I know what happened. I know what happened in my own county. I don't have to tell you, you know. And when that day, it fades with people moving into democracy. It fades with the changes that have happened. But it's not gone yet, but it will go on, you're right. But there is a new Ireland, I have no doubt about it. And when I talk to young people, they're in a different place to all of this. And that is the truth. And I think, we're in a huge testing situation for all of us now. And the COVID, the flu, the Brexit, all of this is going to try the political system and push it really to the limit. And that's what we have to work with.
Look, whatever happens, it looks like it's going to be a tough winter for politicians of all shades, with all the challenges that are coming. So before we all dive under the covers and give up the will to live completely, talk to me about the East Belfast Gaa Club.
East Belfast Gaa Club, I think, is a really wonderful example of what I was talking about earlier on. They are a new GAA club based in the east of the city, which has not for a very long time had much of a GAA presence. I should say I was a very incompetent under 12 player for Loughlin Island GAC many years ago, but I haven't sought a transfer yet to play for East Belfast. It's not actually my constituency. But East Belfast GAA is a club that was set up in the last few months. They are at their core cross-community, and not just cross-community, but cross-identity. In their badge, they have, I think I get this right, they've got a shamrock, they've got the thistle, and they've got the red hand of Ulster. In their on their crest, they've got the Irish, they've got in English, Irish, and Ulster Scots together. They've got the Harland and Wolf, Crane, Samson, and Goliath on their logo. I find that inspirational. I genuinely find it really moving and inspirational to see what those guys had done in terms of bringing a sport and an association which is commonly associated with, if you like, one part of the community, or one community as it's called in the north sometimes. And I have to say I don't love that language. I'm sort of pluralist to my core. But watching the way those guys did it and bring GAA, which yes is associated with nationalism, but to an extraordinary cross-community way in a part of the city which hasn't always been associated with it, and the uptake has been extraordinary. People from all backgrounds, but also people from different political persuasions, I'm sure. I think it's a great initiative, and I think it's an example of people sharing something and getting some exercise as well, which is great, in a way that doesn't commit people to compromising their identity or to giving away their own constitutional preference. You don't have to sign up to Irish unity or anything like that at the door. But it's an absolutely brilliant example of where we go. That's what I think, in a sense, whatever our constitutional future, and yes, I do have preference for constitutional change, and I'm going to talk about that. But the way I'm going to talk about it is the way is in the spirit of East Belfast GAA, and that spirit of seeing ourselves in our neighbours and seeing ourselves in seeing our identity and their identity, sharing it, pooling it. And I hope people from all over the island see some of that. And I hope, I've written articles about this. I would love it if more people in the south looked north, looked to the cranes of Harland and Wolf, and looked to Victorian red brick Belfast and thought, that's Ireland too. That British industrial city is also Ireland. And I think that's great. And I think that's where we go on this island. I think it's really, really, really important. So I would urge anyone who wants to be inspired about the future of this island to go and look at East Belfast GAA.
You gave up the GAA match to be here tonight, didn't you?
I did. Matt, can I just say that Monaghan GAA also has the red hand of Ulster on the crest, so we're way ahead. And while I obviously want to see a united Ireland, in the short term, I will settle for Monaghan winning an All-Ireland. But I have to agree, East Belfast GAA is absolutely, it's inspirational, because despite everything that Matthew has said, and he's absolutely right, it's from, there's also a risk associated with some of the people who put their head out on the block. And I think the way in which they've managed it is something that should be commended, and they deserve the support of not only Gaels all over Ireland, but also of us all. And I agree, we all need to learn about each other's cultures. I need to understand better the basis on which somebody a few miles away from me considers themselves to be British. I accept all of that. We need to do all of that. But none of that should stop the practical and detailed conversations that need to happen in order to make this country a better place. I happen to believe that the best we can make our country, or the best potential to make our country, lies in all of us actually working together, and that means removing the border.
And Stephen Farry, that's the space that you see a future for an even better future for your party in developing in Northern Ireland. Is it all going to be sunny and rosy and a sport, as important as politics and leading the way there?
Well, certainly we had a very good year in 2019, but we can't be complacent and sit back on our laurels. Certainly Northern Ireland is a very fast-changing society, particularly amongst young people who are moving away from traditional labels. So that was a very positive sign. I think at the same time, we need to be very conscious that there's still a large number of people who are caught in a very difficult situation. We still have deep divisions in education and housing. We have communities that are still exploited by paramilitaries on both sides, loyalists and Republicans, dissident Republicans, and that is hugely problematic. But if I can be optimistic, and I think there is a new opportunity with a new government in Northern Ireland and a new government in the South to develop partnerships. That can be without prejudice to the wider constitutional political discussions that I know will happen inevitably, but there is huge scope for cooperation at a practical level. I mean, even, for example, just beginning to think about the north-south rail link between Belfast and Dublin and developing that economic corridor.
Don't forget Cork, Stephen. It goes to Cork as well. Don't forget that.
Don't forget the West. If I can make a suggestion, even Steve may agree with this one. The money that Boris is thinking of building on this bridge between Scotland could be far better invested in terms of more practical infrastructure development on the island in all directions, north, south, and east to west on the island too.
Steve?
Yeah.
Thank you for your brevity. Do you know what struck me listening to all of you today? And you know, we've all seen the political scenes in the House of Commons this past year. We've seen the difficulties that face the executive. We've seen our own travails here in the South in government formation, and certainly a stormy conclusion to the political term last night. And we all know that, you know, there's a tough winter ahead. But what I'm struck by is there's a kind of an optimism amongst you all. And I'm just going to give you all of that kind of thought to wrap up with. Stephen, you can pick up that ball. Go on.
Which Stephen? You always have a problem because Stephen and Stephen tend to go in the media quite a lot together. And when we get an extra journalist who's also called Stephen, it gets really confusing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Which one do you want?
Yeah, the one on the bottom, Stephen Farry, please.
Oh, right, me, right, okay. See, you have longer to think. I think that we are certainly trying to see the opportunities that lie ahead. I think we equally need to be realistic. I mean, what happens around Brexit is going to be massively complicated. Without going into the detail on that, but that is going to pose a lot of difficulties. But particularly for Northern Ireland, where we sit, based upon the protocol, could leave us in a situation where we have almost a bridge to both the rest of the UK and to the wider Ireland and European market. That could go very badly wrong for us, but equally it could open opportunities. I think there is a recognition that the all-island context is massively underdeveloped. I think that's probably where I was trying to base most of my optimism, and with proper engagement and a pragmatic approach from both sides of the border, I think there's a lot of mutual benefits that we can achieve.
Just by the way, before I bring in the other panellists on that question of optimism, in the House of Commons, is there enough interest in developing all of that East-West dialogue?
It probably needs a refreshment. There is a lot of a lack of understanding of both parts of the island of Ireland. You have a lot of new Conservatives. That institutional knowledge that was built up, particularly in the Conservative Party, from the early 90s onwards, from Peter Brook through to Paddy Mayhew, even through to people like Julian Smith, hasn't really carried through to the bulk of the party. Boris Johnson tends to be an English nationalist, as Steve has mentioned earlier. That is a problem. So there is a piece of work there to educate the wider UK Parliament about Ireland. Obviously, we had a different balance of representation in the 2019 elections, with Claire Hanna and Colin Eastwood alongside myself getting elected for the first time. So that has changed the whole nature of the Northern Ireland representation, and that over time I think will bear a lot of good results.
Yes, and that's a big challenge for your parliament, for your parliamentary committee as well.
Absolutely,
as to
we're well up to it. I've met with Steve many times, and we have great conversations with our people in the UK and in Scotland and in Wales. And you know, we have lots of good plans before Brexit came. But I think I would be very hopeful. Certainly, I'm absolutely committed for the time I'm in this job to make sure that all of these hopes and dreams are come true as best we can in a practical way, without any of the old animosities or negative feelings we can all work together. I think, Steve, we were talking about Irish dancing one time. I think you were saying that your daughters went to Irish dancing. A lot of people from the unionist tradition go there because you don't see it as an identity issue. It's something that you like to do, and it's not politicized. And I was quite struck by that. There are lots of things we could actually that share our cultures in a cultural way, and our practical politics in a business-like way. And I think that's the future as I see it.
Matt?
Well, I think, so I, like in a sense, I'm optimistic about, some of the opportunities that face this island. And actually, I hope that these islands, to go back to what Steve said earlier on, even as someone who wants constitutional change on this island, it matters profoundly to me what happens on the island of Britain. I don't view it as an evil alien kind of, though I want constitutional change here, I think we need a close relationship with Britain. I worry very much, however, about, so first of all, we're going to have a really difficult period coming out of the COVID-19 crisis. Economies everywhere are going to struggle. We don't know how we're going to come out of it, basically, and that's not really to do with Britain or Ireland so much as just, this is unprecedented what we're coming out of in the next wee while. But added to that, Brexit is going to be a real bloody nightmare, to be honest, Anya. It's a really, really tricky situation. So I'm really optimistic about young people. I'm really optimistic about the spirit of sharing. It's a spirit that we've created in these islands that, goes back to the Good Friday Agreement. And I do think there's the possibility of a new Ireland there, and that's with or without constitutional change, though I'd very much like to see constitutional change. But in the short term, and we've got to get through this first before we get near constitutional change or referenda, we have to deal with this nightmare that's Brexit. And we need to make the Ireland Protocol work for people in the north, for businesses and for everyone on this island. That needs to be operational, that needs good faith, that needs hard work, it needs lots and lots of talk. And one positive note is that we are there, we're talking, there's a government in place down here, the institutions are they're there. They're not necessarily functioning completely perfectly, but they're there. And we need those functioning, and we need to really work hard on maintaining relationships and getting through what is going to be a really, really difficult 6 months at the very least.
How tricky those next 6 months, Matt Carthy?
The next 6 months, there's some big challenges, but I joined Sinn Féin in 1996 in this city, where I couldn't leave a meeting without being stopped by the Garda Special Branch at a time when Sinn Féin didn't have a single TD, a single MP in the north. We had about 20 councillors all over the island of Ireland. It was about 2 years since representatives and members of my party couldn't even be heard on the airwaves or on broadcast on television. And last night I walked out from the Dáil as part of the largest single party and as part of an all-Ireland party that has representatives in every possible institution, where we're part of government in the north, we're waiting to be in government in the south. And when I combine the knowledge of the growth that I've seen in my political lifetime with the knowledge that when the Irish people are given the clear chance and the clear opportunity to grasp a better and a fairer and a united Ireland, I know that they're going to take it. I see it as my political job, and all of our political jobs, is to give them the opportunity to do so. So yes, absolutely. For all the big challenges we have, I'm optimistic.
And Steve Aiken, I'll give the final word to you. I was just saying before we started, this time next year we'll know the answers to so many things. We'll know a bit more indeed about what Brexit actually means. So cautiously optimistic, would you say that's your watchword about the winter ahead?
Well, sort of next year is, of course, our centenary. And we move on proudly into the second century of Northern Ireland. And there is much to celebrate and much to look forward to. And one of the ways we want to celebrate that is to be able to improve our relationships, particularly with the Irish Republic. And I am looking forward, as the leader of the Ulster Unionist Party and the party that helped set up Northern Ireland in the first place, to be able to keep on fostering that relationship and making sure we're doing the right thing for everybody across these islands. And I think that's important. But there's when we talk about optimism, I would need to go back and listen to what Michel Barnier, and also sort of the new EU president, when she was in Dublin Castle, it doesn't seem that long ago. And she was talking about how she could make the relationship between the United Kingdom and Europe. For that, she meant the United Kingdom and Ireland work in that context there. And she talked about doing something with the lightest possible touch. Now, if we do get to the point, and I think if we do have the lightest possible touch, particularly on East-West trade and also North-South relationships, and we look and think, rather than just trying to go for absolute positions and from the EU or absolute positions in the UK, but look at what's best for Northern Ireland. And if it's what's best for Northern Ireland, could actually turn out to be what's best for the future relationship between the United Kingdom and the rest of the European Union. And indeed for the Irish Republic, which is going to be in a really difficult situation, because bearing in mind, sir, there'll be pressures on corporation tax, there's going to be pressures on reshoring back to the United States, the digital transformation that's going to be required, and the fact in the Irish Republic now, you're now major net contributors to the EU. All these things together shows that what we should be doing is looking to work together. What I want to get back is to the point where 3 years ago, I could pick up the telephone and talk to Charlie Flanagan, or Charlie Flanagan pick up the telephone and talk to me, and we could actually solve things that way. And unfortunately, over the last sort of couple of years with both the previous Taoiseach and very definitely Simon Coveney, that hasn't been the case. I want to get back to the point where we have that degree of relationships, where Fergus can ring me up and say, Steve, what the heck are you doing? And I can ring him up and says, what's your flipping committee doing this time? And that's the relationship we had. I want us to get back to that point. But what I want you all to do is all you want to come up to Northern Ireland next year and help us celebrate our 100th anniversary and look proudly to the next century.
Not much to celebrate on you, unfortunately, over the last 100 years of the misrule of Steve's Party of the North.
There are so many differences in team.
You've just in one small sentence just put down to the point about what the question is we need to have about respect, okay? We need to have, if we're going to seriously have mutual respect, you've got to join in that respect.
Well, Steve, to be honest, I absolutely respect all political opinion, but you're never going to get me to respect the manner in which your party dominated and marginalised Irish citizens in the north of Ireland. It was the cause of the conflict. Thankfully, we're beyond it, and that's the cause of optimism.
Well, I've no doubt.
Matt, tell you what, why don't you come up to the 21st century? Why don't you actually look at what we're trying to do? Why don't you try and understand why we're trying to make a new Northern Ireland for everybody and park that? Come on, let's get to the 21st century. Let's try and get a proper relationship going. And when you do that, that will be better for everybody. And tell you
absolutely,
what,
I'm all for better relationships. I'm just not for rewriting history.
I was going to say, only in the spirit of finding something I hope we could all agree on, that the one of the best things that could come out of this winter is that President Joe Biden is elected at the start of November, and we can start 2021 with a new US president. I think that would be something that's something to look forward to. I hope no one's going to dissent from that.
That trumps every idea.
Look, all I can say is thank you all for joining us, and particularly I'd like to thank Steve and Stephen for bearing with us remotely. It's never easy when you're at the end of the line. And look, just to say thank you to everyone for putting this together, honest to God, because it really wasn't easy in the times that we're living in. And to hope Gomeramid's Biower and I'm sure Rish that next year we'll actually be with a live audience, and wouldn't that be great? That'd be something we might even have a drink or two ourselves then. Anyhow, till then, slán. Thank you all.